This session looks at internationalism. What does it mean to be international in the context of art as it relates to galleries, institutions, and art publications today? And does international mean the incorporation of different languages, different cultures, or simply different points of view? We ask these globally leading figures, as I mentioned, James Green, Mark Rappolt, and Dr. Rory Hyde, if, when it comes to showing international art, there is a difference between tourist and resident. The conversation also examines whether discourse or program is driven by artists or by audiences, and what role of the three types of intermediary might be connecting the two. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, and thank you for having us here. I think you've explained roughly the framework of what we're going to discuss, and I think maybe we should point out that in our own different ways, we act as kind of interfaces between artists and audiences or viewers. We also come from... So Art Review is a magazine that was founded in 1949, very much part of British post-war utopian dreaming, and very local in its initial context. And I think each of us have worked for someone that started off as a very kind of local institution, very much located, in both your cases, in a particular space and place, and, I guess, mind shape. So I wonder maybe we should start talking about that, so where these things come from and where they are now, in a way.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, perhaps I can say a few things about the origins of the V&A and how we find those origins useful to us still today. So, Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, 1851, they organised the Great Exhibition, so the first World Expo, in Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, so designed by Paxton. And what I would think of as really the first kind of, it's the origin of modern industrial architecture and culture. And really their ambition was to do two things, to improve the quality of British design and production. So this is at a point in time when basically the French were better, the Belgians were better, the Germans were better, and how can we improve the quality of British design, but also to improve the quality of British consumers, to improve the attitude to design and amongst the public, and to educate them in what good design is and what good design can do. So that was the sort of founding moment. And then when the museum was built, it had all these other, approaches to hosting visitors, which meant that it was a truly public institution in the sense that the first museum to have late opening hours, so that if you'd been at work all day, that you could still go and see the museum. The first museum to have artificial lighting so that you could see those works in the evenings, and the first museum to have a cafe, which of course is the greatest contribution to museum culture the world over, is the museum cafe. And all of those three things add up to the ambition to be a truly public museum and a truly public space. And I guess those are the things that we grab hold on to now as curators in terms of how we frame our work and how we address our audience. Is we try to speak to a very broad audience, and we try to be as inclusive as possible, and to demystify art and culture for people, not just those who are sort of initiates or who have studied it, but for people who walk in off the street, or for tourists, or for whoever it is. So that's certainly the kind of founding way of thinking about what we do. And perhaps just to mention one thing which I hope we can discuss as well, is we're at a point now where we're explicitly looking more internationally. So we've just last year opened up a new museum in Dundee in Scotland. The year before, in 2016, we opened in Shenzhen in China, and we're also working on two new museums in a different part of London, in East London, which is explicitly about addressing a different audience to where we are in West London. So there's a kind of explicit moment of expansion, and then with that comes a reconsideration of what our values are and what the role of the museum is today, and how do we take those forward into other contexts, which is complicated.
Hi, thank you. So I'm here on behalf of the gallery I work for, David Werner. So a bit about us. Started by a German in New York 26 years ago. So as Mark mentioned, sort of rooted in that space with one gallery, with an idea of showing art that had not been, or artists rather, that hadn't been shown in New York before. And now here we are 26 years later, in New York, in London, in Hong Kong, with art fairs in, I think, 12 or 13 different countries, with artists from all over the world, with partnerships with museums and biennials and relationships all over the world, and with a digital presence which sort of further broadens that audience and takes things maybe away from a specific space. Slightly as a commercial gallery, we are sort of the idea of the institution is maybe less dominant for us, and it really is about our artists, those artists we represent and work with. There are 53 of them, that audience and that and where those artists can be shown, understood, have dialogues. That's kind of really what it comes down to for us. And all these avenues and how we've expanded, how the art world has expanded in those 26 years, has sort of added to that, I think.
And do you see the sort of international spaces as operating with a core central program that's the same wherever the exhibition's happening? So the philosophy, the attitude you take to an audience, is that the same whether it's Hong Kong or London or New York? Or does each one have a kind of different way of operating?
I think, thankfully, there still is variation. And I think, there maybe is a danger with a sort of slight homogenization about how, firstly, there would be the danger of artists were making the same sort of work with the same ideas for a similar audience. And I think that, speaking on the artist's behalf, the most interesting thing for them is when an institution in a different place, a curator with a different background, who they are then working with, brings a different understanding or a different context maybe to an aspect of their work. Whilst, on the other hand, there are artists who want to sort of remain more focused on maybe an initial grounding or viewpoint with their work, and that meaning can maybe, whilst that stays quite resolute, the sort of the way that the message or the way that it might come across would possibly change a little bit.
And is that the same with your different spaces? For instance, in China, is it a radically different approach to programming?
Yeah, all the different new spaces are trying to respond to those local contexts. So in Dundee, it's very much a student town, so what's been important there is to create the new gallery of Scottish design, so to really retell that history from our really strong collection of Scottish design in Scotland. So that's, sort of, I guess you would say, it's forming an educational role, as a role of reference and inspiration for the students, mainly. But also it's playing into other larger games played by the city and so on as a new icon, a new attraction, and that's why we're working with Kengo Kuma, and it's a sort of destination piece of architecture. So there's other motives involved as well, and other models of financing and so on. And in China, it's a 5-year, so it's a temporary commitment, where we have a gallery there as part of a larger cultural centre, and really it's about training and skills and educating the new managers of that new institution in the way that we work. So we've got a team out there who will work with them for 5 years, on all sorts of processes, from curating exhibitions to cataloguing to managing an archive, and it's really a sort of skills exchange rather than a kind of cultural mission, as if you like. Yeah, we're trying to let them do the speaking once we leave.
I mean, certainly with my experience with Art Review, after 63 years of this magazine existing, Matisse was writing for it, pop art was invented in it, always with a broad reach to sort of popular culture or general culture and art culture. There was a time when I was in Shanghai and being shown a work of art, a neon piece. And as gallerists do, the gallerist sort of sidled up very smoothly behind me and then whispered in my ear, like, "What do you think?" Which I always find slightly uncomfortable because I'm used to writing it, not saying it. And I told him I thought nothing because the whole text was in Mandarin of this neon work. And he said, "Oh, I'll tell you what it means." And I said, "It still means nothing because it's only you who's telling me what it means. I don't know if that's true or not." And at that point, we decided to set up a second magazine, Art Review Asia, which is based in Shanghai and Singapore and comes partly out of histories of modernity in Southeast Asia and a certain impossibility there of locating yourself in time and space. So as these countries there are becoming independent, how do you be true to your traditions and the environment you're from, but also contemporary and make a break at the same time? There are multiple stories like this, and I think some of them were touched on earlier today. But we've certainly found that from a writing side, context varies, and readings varies, and perspectives vary. And I think for us, there's been a sense of rejecting the idea that you can drop anything anywhere, and it reads the same way, or it's instantly understood. And I wonder if that's something you adapt to in what you do too.
I mean, I think we're almost painfully aware of our context in the sense that, and that happens when we operate in South Kensington or when we tour an exhibition, that it's anything we do comes with the assumptions of what the V&A is expected to do. And that, in South Kensington, it means that in the context of London, that we're the sort of the big old stuffy museum, and so whenever we do anything half interesting, everyone is amazed. So it's quite easy to surprise people when you're the establishment, stuffy, boring place with rooms full of old royal silver. And I think that, but then the opposite is true when we tour, is that people expect to see some of that stuffiness on show, and that they expect to see things. I mean, and I'm being a bit disparaging. I mean, the other thing you could call it is, to bring a certain expertise or a certain rigor, and that is perhaps runs against a certain playfulness that you can get away with if you're a smaller institution or a more experimental institution. So we're constantly. I guess it's for me. I find that context something useful to play with and to kick against and to lean on when it's convenient. But it's a very plural place. I mean, that's the best thing about the V&A is how many different departments. I mean, our team, which is design, architecture, digital, we have I think 5 curators. We're mostly contemporary focused, but there's another 150 curators, each with a particular expertise in some other material or part of the world or art form. So it's very difficult to define what it is that we do, and it sort of is just defined through the doing and where we end up showing.
And do you find that your name's ever kind of a clumsy piece of baggage? Not your personal name, but the institutional name?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's one of those things which. Yeah, I was so surprised yesterday. I've told a few people here, but I was walking around through the markets outside the National Museum here, the Kolkata Museum, and I found some bootleg V&A branded tote bags.
Did you buy one?
I bought 5 from my department, which I thought would be hilarious presents for them. But there's something very strange about that. You know, I mean, as someone said, they were probably made here. Like they're probably actually, they could be legit tote bags. I mean, I don't think we have them in this same fabric. But there's obviously something very resonant about the brand that is international, and it's a very well-known ampersand. But the, you know, at the time when museums, especially museums that were founded you know, hand in hand with the colonial project, with the empire project, are wrestling with that history and on how to reinterpret their collections in particular. It's you know, it's, and especially coming to this country, it's not necessarily something which, you know, I should completely joke about. And yeah, I mean, so it's.
I guess there's also the question
yeah.
of whether that's something you can do as an institution or someone has to come from outside to do. I mean, I think that's one of the big issues with it, right?
I mean, I think that's right. It's hard to speak about this in general terms because, you know, obviously it requires, you know, if we could talk about a specific example or specific works and how we would approach that, then it becomes more. You know, that's the only way to respond to it. Actually, is through the specific rather than the general. But
and do you find that? I mean, David Werner has an international program with artists from all over the world, but you don't always work. You have a Hong Kong gallery, but you have no Hong Kong or Chinese artists. How does that work? Do the artists direct the program then of communicating with an audience, or is that something the gallery plays an active role in interfacing with?
I think there's a balance between, for us in terms of what we're doing with our artists, there's a balance between sort of responding to the audience, and you know, we opened a gallery in Hong Kong at the beginning of last year, and there are artists who've had museum shows in China and be part of biennials and other conversations there where it made sense for us to mount exhibitions of their work early on. But then there's also, you know, if a belief that our program is international. If it's an artist that maybe hasn't had the exposure there, that's not a reason to not do that as well. So there's a balance between responding and sort of proactively showing an artist's work there, and that can kind of that same applies to whether it's, you know, the London space, whether we're doing an art fair in Delhi or in Taipei or wherever it might be. Yeah, it's trying to be sort of balanced across those things, I think.
And I guess part of what you do is also about dialogues with institutions, not just audiences, but with infrastructure in different places and giving the artists opportunities to introduce themselves to audiences outside of the gallery space directly.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, what we do within our physical spaces is a small part of a much broader dialogue that has to happen, you know, across everything that an artist might do. Whether it's with, you know, whether it's with art review, it's with magazines, it's with museums, curators, yeah, I think, you know, back to this idea of where the sort of the digital space comes in. I think that's become something that's really, in terms of the reach, and you know, you look at then who is reviewing artists' the exhibitions on the website, and when you look at analytics of where people are, you sort of realize that even though you're in these three continents with galleries, it can reach much wider than that. And I think that's something that's only going to continue to broaden as well.
Language was something that was brought up in the previous panel. And I think certainly when Art Review Asia was started, we spent the first 2 years fighting about what language it was going to be in. And after a long conversation, we decided it was either going to have so many languages it was the size of a phone book, or English would be the least bad language. But I think, again, that's something we are revisiting now, and I think in the coming years it will move away from English and have different incarnations in different places. We work with a lot of fiction writers from places like Tamil Nadu, Bangkok, who write in the native language and are translated, and we have an archive now of their own native texts that, again, we're looking to develop. And I know you've been experimenting with WeChat a bit, and I wonder if there's a limitation to always doing things in English, and that one of the things about being international is moving away from that as a kind of dominant language.
I mean, we are sort of English language gallery, but we have for the exhibition catalogues for the Hong Kong shows. They are bilingual, and I think that was something that was discussed quite widely. But I think that's been necessary, and also, if it comes down to this idea of increasing the reach and audience of these, whether it's the exhibition catalogue, whether it's the exhibition itself, as a gallery, we have to do what's best to ensure that. So in that case, I think it would always remain a kind of case-by-case basis. Certainly, there is that issue that you say where if you can, make something that is too broad, so you have to sort of limit yourself in some way. But I think, it depends on, you have to defer to what's necessary, I think.
And is the V&A looking to expand on that front?
I mean, we do the usual things, which is to translate our catalogues where we're touring shows and so on. So far in South Kensington, it's English, but it's something that we're looking at, especially looking at our demographics of visitorship. But in London, again, there's 140 languages spoken in London. So how do you decide which ones to translate? I mean, to give another example, perhaps, we did a project a couple of years ago as part of the Bi-City Biennale, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and we just gave our time. So we arrived with a month before opening, it started with the few people that we knew, got them to introduce us to more and more people, and each time we're asking people, what object represents your city? What is the thing that you would want to show a different audience that somehow captures your experience? And some of the things were really weird, like somebody showed the toothbrush stand with representing all the different people who they shared with, as a sort of comment on the housing crisis, that they could never own their own. Somebody showed a wheel clamp, like from the traffic police, locking up your car, because parking was so impossible that people had invented a fake wheel clamp to put on their cars so that it looked like it had already been clamped, but actually it allowed them just to park for free wherever they wanted. So, and all of those projects came out of the crowdsourcing, if you like. So, and then through that process, we would write the labels with those people, and we had their own sort of telling their own stories alongside our more kind of art curatorial language because we also tried to sort of dispassionately describe these things as well as tell those stories. So, and that's a process which is part of the sort of origins of our rapid response collecting program. So that's about collecting things which are a bit more everyday or which are related to the social context or the political context, but very much about context. So we're now applying that same logic in different cities. We will do it in Russia, and we will do it in Australia, and we're sort of opening up to see what new ideas can come from different kinds of places.
So in a sense, it's also, the program itself takes the form of a rapid response to different communities and different geographies. And maybe going back to what we touched on earlier about someone from the outside internationalizing the institution.
Exactly. And the other important thing to say about this rapid response project is that it's rapid response collecting. So all of those things end up in the V-Day's collection, and they have the same status as anything else. So over time, we hope that, and all of those things, of course, are archived with the voices of the people who nominated them. So those two things remain connected in terms of the catalogue, and the V&A were obsessed with the archive and talking about looking after things forever. So these have the same, these will be looked after with the same care as our sketchbooks from Leonardo. And I think that's also important, is to take some toothbrushes from Shenzhen and to say, no, these can have a different power and a different status and tell a different story. And in the future, when they're exhibited outside of Shenzhen, they can take on different connections and be in dialogue with different things, perhaps from other parts of those projects or from other things in the collection. I mean, one of the things I like to talk about is curating in triangles. So we normally like to imagine there's this very linear relationship between a visitor or a viewer and an artwork, and that it's quite a unobstructed, clean engagement. But actually there's so many other things going on, and so we try to acknowledge what those other things are, and that's what makes it a triangle. It's that third thing. And it could just be that you're sort of looking at the work, but you're also looking at how someone else is looking at the work, and you're aware of their reaction to it, which is what makes museums public. Or it could be that we have asked a question. It may be related to the work or maybe not, but it certainly changes your relationship to the work. So we're interested in kind of collecting those third points in the triangle to try and destabilize that assumed engagement with the works.
I mean, does that mean you're also stepping back from overly interpreting the works, which is a frequent critique of museums, right? Not just showing people what's there, but telling them what to think and what it means. And
absolutely. I mean, for the last big show that I did, we worked really hard on getting that voice right, and it was, I mean, the form of our labels, which are very brief, 60 words. We tried to tell you exactly what it is, unambiguously, and so we call that a sort of handrail. If you just want to know what the hell I'm looking at, I haven't seen this thing before, I can read the first sentence and I feel safe, and then we'll try to open it up, and so rather than closing it down to tell you exactly how it's used or how it's why you should care, to actually open up the context which it sits within, or to ask you a question, or to try and connect that thing to your own life. I mean, I'm much, when I get excited in museums is that feeling that you've worked something out for yourself, that you've discovered it yourself. You haven't just been told it. There's no fun in being told. And it's that feeling of somehow leaping into the unknown and working something out. So, but which is sort of runs against the whole, idea of what a museum is for. So we're trying to balance that, explore that. Yeah. But I was going to ask you a question as well, Mark, rather than us doing all the talking, which is. When you take art review to Asia, which part of art review goes with it?
So all the team for Art Review Asia are based in Asia, actually. They're all Asians except for me, and I'm perversely Asian in a different kind of way. And I think that was also important to sort of, I guess, represent a kind of mixed race, not from a particular place. And my mother shares this with me. She's Sri Lankan Tamil who grew up and was born in Kuala Lumpur, about which I get asked every time I come through immigration in India, on the basis that I might be some sort of concealed Muslim, I think. But from my perspective, I was interested in this kind of feeling of coming from nowhere, partly European, partly South Asian, partly Southeast Asian, and very much formed as an ideology in Southeast Asian art history, because it's more interestingly screwed up, I think. But everyone else is from the place they write about. I think that maybe the more interesting thing was that a lot of the writers we work with are not art experts or art historians. So a lot of fiction writers. And we also became very interested in, say, a word like Nusantara, archipelago in Malay and Bahasa, means an entirely different thing if you're Malaysian and you say it, because it means an archipelago with Malaysia in the middle of it. And if you're in Indonesia, it means an archipelago with Indonesia in the middle of it. So we became very interested in exploring how these dynamics might affect how art is understood or looked at. And that meant working with people from those contexts or with a particular expertise. Or I think, in a funny way, the biggest issue is having to deal with all the different ways our writers and editors might end up in prison in their various contexts, and what are the kind of cultural sensibilities of the area. So it can just be something where, at least one of them has multiple death threats at the moment, writes about religion and caste. And obviously there's issues with censorship in places like Singapore and China, that we have to navigate because we physically have people there who would be held accountable to what we do, which is very different when it was just art review and we were external, so we would certainly make broader statements then, and now we have to be a lot more sensitive. I mean, that's maybe an interesting issue for all of us in terms of cultural sensitivities, not just in hometown, but also in the places where you're taking artifacts or toothbrushes or showing works. I mean, I wonder how you deal with that, if you have to deal a lot with it.
It's something, as we've been doing, showing more in China. I mean, it doesn't quite apply in Hong Kong, but certainly when, as of 2 years now, we've been doing art fairs in mainland China, where you do have to submit a list of artworks you're bringing in to the censors before, and certain artworks do get blocked. Normally based on nudity, but this is then something that you're having to sort of navigate, and then as a gallery, then you're in a position where, or the artist rather, is then compromised if they want to show there. If they are exhibiting there, they're not reflecting their full practice or their full output. So then it becomes about whether it's better then to not show there or for that artist to not show at all. And these are quite complex questions, really. I think it's sort of, we tend to leave that to the artist rather than to make that decision. But it is something that we hadn't really had to deal with before the last couple of years.
One of the, we're obviously quite conscious of trying not to self-censor. So I like the approach of let's try and get some things through, and if we get knocked back, well, at least we've tried. I mean, one of the other things that we've noticed, especially doing this exhibition recently on the future of technology and working with the very big technology companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and so on, is that they operate now in a similar way to how working in China or in Singapore, in the sense that the condition of the loan will be sign off on your label text and on how it's displayed and on what else is in the exhibition. And for us, it's actually harder to push against those organisations than it is often against governments, because it's less clear what the criteria is, and there is no official review board or anything. It sort of happens in between the lines. So we've had huge fights with Facebook and with Google on how to present their work and on not giving them any veto on our, or any editing rights on our labels or catalogue text. I think that's a very scary new future when they're increasingly involved in arts institutions and in how art is presented.
I mean, I think it's important to say that's quite a universal thing. It's not anything specific to a particular geography. So, for instance, with Art Review, we used to have the most problems in America, by far, with censorship, and that was simply because Borders happened to be owned by Mormons who took a particular view about nudity and had classified us as a porn magazine. So I think, that different places, different problems, in a way.
And I think, I can say a little bit about the project we did with Facebook, which was to present their drone, it's called Aquila. It's an incredible thing. It has a wingspan of 45 meters, so the same as a 747, but it weighs only 300 kilograms, so the three of us could lift it just about. And it was part of their whole philanthropic project, so-called humanitarian project, to bring the internet to the whole world, or what Mark Zuckerberg calls connecting up the next billion. And he would explicitly say the whole of India, the whole of Africa, all of these people who don't have internet are going to get online through Facebook because of these drones. And I think they were really surprised that people were critiquing it. They just thought, why would anybody who could disagree with this gift that I am in Silicon Valley am offering to you, people, the whole of Africa. And so we commissioned a very critical, well, we didn't ask it to be commissioned, but to be critical rather, but we invited Teju Cole, the Nigerian-American, mostly fiction writer, to respond to the idea of the Aquila. That was our only brief, was say, please write about this. And it was obviously quite critical, and at one point it was sent to Facebook, to their comms team, during the editing process, but through some sort of mistake. But basically I was on the phone 3 times a day with Facebook comms to try and let them, because we'd already hung the drone in the gallery, so if they wanted to take it back, we needed to clear out every single other work in the exhibition. So it's these sorts of scenarios. But I would guess it's only to say that I was completely shocked by their naivety in the kind of misalignment between their good intentions and that it may be received as not good intentions by somebody else. And of course the whole battle over internet.org, which has really taken place in this country, is certainly the backdrop to that.
And I wonder, James, I was going to ask if you ever have an artist who maybe wants to show work in, let's say, China, that you know is never going to pass the censors. Let's say it's a religious scene that cuts to a sex scene that cuts to a protest scene. No chance whatsoever. Would you then put that forward if the artist wanted to sort of test it? Or do you kind of say, hey, look, that's not really going to work for anyone?
I mean, I think we would, because also simply because there isn't, it doesn't affect, they treat each thing as an individual basis. But at the same time, our job is really also to try and find a way that it might. So even if that avenue is not the way to show the work there, but there's something else that can be done, and I think this also can reflect to how images are shared, information is shared, or things are done digitally. I think at the same time you do have to be sensitive to the audience as well. So maybe that as a gallery we do have a slight responsibility with that, which is maybe also an interesting thing. It's where on sort of our side of the art world, something a gallery like mine didn't really think so much about was the audience. We've sort of focused on our artists, our programming, but no, you have this change where I think when the gallery opened, the show had 100 visitors. For a show in London or New York, you'd be quite happy, and now, a gallery like ours can have 2,000 on a weekend. So things like labeling and that sort of broad outreach to the to the wider audiences are things that actually people, non-institutional galleries like us, have to kind of consider a bit more. But this is all sort of, again, a relatively new conversation on our side, I think.
And I guess certainly something like Art Review Asia deals with a lot of online readers who approach it in a different way than, say, 20 years ago. To what extent, I wonder, do you have to adapt to audiences that aren't actually physically ever going to come, for whatever reason, to the gallery, but are an audience that sees what you're doing through images, online, other people's selfies? Is that an audience you actively think about now when you're making an exhibition?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but we try to talk about our digital experience as another museum. There's something. We'll get, I think, more or less 5 million visitors to South Kensington each year, but 60 million digital people. So how do you make that meaningful? And so we're completely redoing the website, completely redoing that sort of front of house. And it's all about, I'm speaking for my colleagues in the digital department, but it is motivated by getting real visitors, ultimately, and that it's about that visitor pathway, that you can You might see something online or somebody's their own social media post about the exhibition, and you connect that to the website, and you connect that to visiting hours and to how to get there, and that whole path is actually mapped out for you. I mean, I guess that's different for international audiences who are less likely to visit. But and so that's where we try to replicate some of those experiences of the exhibitions online, increasingly publishing our catalogues in an open manner, documenting the shows in more coherent ways, not just as marketing but as a sort of attempt to replicate the experience, and using different kinds of media, making films and that sort of thing. So I think we're quite comfortable with that ambiguity of the role of the website, in the sense that it needs to satisfy so many different kinds of audiences, from the academic to the potential tourist. And I mean, we don't have time for it, but the role that I thought the previous discussion around digitizing collections and the role that plays is. It requires a much bigger thought. I mean, there was the sense that we just put it all on there and that somehow deals with it. And maybe that's useful I think that's probably most useful for curators and for other museums who want to work out their loans. But actually, does that necessarily justify the efforts? And how do we really connect our online publics with the collection in a way that makes sense when they're completely severed of their context?
I mean, there's a thing that Walt Disney used to say when he was building Disneyland, right? That at the end of every street there has to be a wiener, and he was referring to the hot dogs that are used in movies to make dogs jump. That would be offset. You wouldn't see them, but then the dog would jump up because someone's dangling a hot dog. And then his view was that every kind of, in the entertainment experience of Disneyland, you should have one of those at the end of every street. And I think you do notice in exhibitions that there are wieners all over the place. The thing that you can take a picture of, and however bad your phone camera is, it's going to look roughly the same and spectacular. Or the kind of exhibition where you can take a picture of everything in one shot. And I think that's something we've certainly become increasingly conscious of, particularly in terms of what images institutions would send us.
I mean, perhaps, James, you can also jump in here. Sorry to be yakking away, but I mean, as speaking now only as a curator, not as the marketing department or as the digital department, one of the first questions we get asked is, where's the selfie moment? And for me, that's a slippery slope, isn't it? I mean, when... it's the increasing kind of lifestyle or vanity or entertainment. And when I say that out loud, it sounds sort of snobbish, but actually, museums are more than that. I mean, we laugh, but the popularity. Okay, so I'll give one specific example quickly, which is that I've just finished a small show on social housing. It's drawings, architectural drawings of fantastic buildings from the last 100 years, mostly in London, built for the public. And where that gallery is right next to our sort of one of our smaller temporary spaces, where there was an exhibition put on by an external company, which was called the Museum of Gingerbread. And it was all these architects who, for Christmas, had built gingerbread houses. And it cost money to get into the gingerbread exhibition. And there was a queue going past my gallery of social housing, and nobody was going in, even though they were both ostensibly about architecture. So, and of course, one of them smelled like gingerbread and was covered in sugar. And a friend of mine who works in the galleries as a gallery attendant, he sent me the funniest text. He said, well, obviously the social housing exhibition should have been made out of gingerbread in order to drive numbers. And that's sort of where we are. If you want to just drive numbers, or you want to just have people take photographs, then make it out of gingerbread. But what do you have left, actually? You've got nothing.
Crumbs.
So I think it's our job to resist those forces. But I haven't worked out what the argument is. That's the trouble. Yeah. It seems absurd to argue against visitors.
and this, this issue of photography, and we tend to allow photography of shows, and you have to be aware that you kind of lose the days when you kind of controlled how, on behalf of your artists, or they controlled how their artwork is sort of shown to the world are over. Social media and everything else. But at the same time, we did do a show recently with the Estate of the Ann Arbus, where actually they're unusual in our program where they do not allow any photography in the exhibitions. So for the first time, for as long as we can remember, there was no photography allowed. And it was it was an interesting experiment into what the reaction from our public, so to speak, was, and it wasn't an issue at all. I mean, maybe it's not as selfie-friendly, but I think it's something that you have to kind of contend with. And at the same time, of course, there are the benefits to these images of your exhibitions and your artist's work being shared all over the world in different places. So there's a balance somewhere. But what that is a thing that's still to be defined, probably.
I mean, I wonder if now's a good time to allow questions from the audience.
There's lots of images of the gingerbread museum.
Just Google it, right?
Thank you very much. In terms of establishing, let's say, a unit of the V&A in some other country, or establishing a gallery, how is it that it is reflected in the, whether you call it the Articles of Association of the V&A Museum, or in the mandate, in the written mandate of it? What is the purpose? And is it articulated about establishment of branches of the museums in other places? It has to be. How is it?
It is, but it's not it's not the same across the board. It's for the specific instances. So, for instance, in Scotland, the museum is owned and run by the Scottish government. So it's really a agreement to share the collections, but it's managed independently. And we have some guidelines, of course, on what needs to be V&A. And as I mentioned, in China, it's a temporary relationship, which is more about skill. So in a way, that's a contract which doesn't get written. It doesn't change our mission. So it's really on. Does that answer your question? It's on case by case.
Sort of, yeah. But what is the purpose? It's not just revenue.
Sorry?
It's not just revenue, is it?
Not just revenue? It's
not just revenue. I mean, the purpose, revenue is part of the purpose, but it's not just that. And is that establishment funded by the government, or is it?
In China? Are you asking?
China or wherever else?
Well, in Scotland it is. In China it's private funding for that museum. And no, certainly the mission is not just revenue.
That's what I meant. It's not just revenue. It's
no, and in
so
Scotland
it's not articulated as such. I mean,
no.
Okay.
I mean,
that's
and
fine.
I think that's.
How much of this internationalism or so-called internationalism is linked to geopolitics and economics? Because it strikes me that some of these, and especially talking from a British UK cultural perspective, where you have, partner countries or, countries in the spot, they tend to be, in my view, countries that Britain wants to make economic and political partnerships and collaborations with. And so, China often comes up, Brazil, Mexico, India, South Africa, and the danger in that is that you then come to sort of homogenize an entire region through the lens of a particular country. Do you find that, or am I mistaken in that?
Shall I respond to that?
I'm happy to as well.
Oh, go on.
I mean, I think outside of the institution, of course, I think you could look at the way global discourse on art develops, and it is, roughly speaking, economics and geopolitics that the conversation spreads, right? But, I mean, certainly from our point of view, those things are very important, but I think the difference is with a magazine about writing, for instance, is that it's very much formed from our personal stories or the stories that are personal to the artists we work with, and it develops in a slightly different way, but from the point of view of just having to fund the thing, then it does necessarily follow to some degree a place where we can make a new magazine or a project or a conference or an exhibition economically viable, because we're not in a position to go completely against that, whereas in research we are to some degree, so it's kind of a mixed thing, but it might be different for... I mean, you're certainly very conscious that art is a slave to these things.
Hi. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much. The question is about Dundee V&A. What is the uniqueness of Dundee V&A? And let me give a disclaimer. I have been a student in Dundee, and I did participate in the process of choosing of the architectural design, which all of us did when I was a student there. So I know it opened last year. So what is the uniqueness of V&A, Dundee?
Big question. Good. I mean, it's designed by Kengo Kuma, and who's a Japanese architect, of course. He's very much not connected to Scotland, but he's tried to. I mean, my understanding is that he's trying to bridge various approaches and various places. So it responds to the place by responding to the docks and the ships, and it has a prow of a ship, which is quite literal. But it also responds to, I think it responds to the local place again through its materiality. It has these granite fins, which are also mined in Scotland. But what Kuma has brought to it as well, I think, is his philosophy of design and his philosophy of the contemporary moment, which is he describes not making buildings out of single things, but making them out of assemblages, and that it should somehow feel like a swarm or something which is accreted through many small parts, and that's, I think, his response to the pluralism of the design in the world and in Scotland and in the collections. So, I mean, overwhelmingly the response has been positive, and I think that's the power of architecture, isn't it? To produce something which can resonate with different people in different ways, and it's one of these things which I think has many readings, and that's the strength of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. As Dr. Hyde was telling us, like the previously tangible artworks are now getting converted into more of a virtual presence. We're having them on the digital world. So, and what used to happen before, if there's an artwork or anything, it was created by the artist from, let's say, the grassroots level. And now whenever something is being put on the digital part, we are already working on an existing framework, and from some already existing things, no matter how original the idea may be, some other elements are being used that are not made by like the person itself, but some other people. I mean, as an artist, we are always taking from nature, but nature does not roam around claiming gratitude from us. But when it comes about people, we have to. So do you think like we are heading more towards an like collective art approach through this digital thing? And if so, like as James was saying, our artworks are being contactly photographed, like it's being posted on social media. So this collectiveness, will it reduce the constraints of copyright, which to some extent like restricts united growth?
I could only hear half of your question because the acoustics are bad, but I think I've got the gist of it. it's funny the way that I think if I've understood your question correctly, I think it's exciting the way that people use their images of photographs, especially in social media, as a reflection of their own values, and that that borrowing of someone else's creation of their image to inform the way that they want to see themselves is a great compliment and a great role that this media can play. I think it introduces a new dynamic in that. In a way, it's like the triangular curating thing that I was describing. You no longer have this linear relationship to a work, but somebody else is contributing to it.
Like, that's what I was trying to ask, like this non-linear connection that is happening, like it's happening between the artist and his or her audience, it is also happening between different artists who are not necessarily in the same media, right? Like, that's what I'm trying to ask. And like, is it like happening in a good way? Like, I've heard like my university's other department researchers saying that the other universities, they're having their copyrighted, patented ideas very secretly kept. So even if like an Indian scientist is very smart, what scientific advancement has been achieved by Oxford University is not being revealed to them. Whereas in our field, whatever we're being able to create the next morning, we're being able to publish it to the whole world. So,
because I can only half hear you, and we have to finish. Should we can have a chat in the break if you,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is where we have to leave things off, but as Rory suggested, I'm sure you can ask any other questions privately. I'd like to thank you both for being here, and thanks for welcoming us.